All right, welcome back. Today we're going to go through the third or the fourth factor within this industrialized, urbanized melting pot that we have that is ever expanding west. And so we're going to talk about the two factors, whether it's migration, immigration, and the building of an urbanized America that is building towards a fully industrialized and fully expansive world, and all the problems that that brings towards America. And so when we look at the urbanization and the sort of Horatio Alger myth that we're going to create, urbanization is a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, but also a source that helps create the Industrial Revolution. You need the labor to run the factories, but of course the urbanized populations are going to center around those industrial factories. So if you build a factory, you'll have a city around it. If you build a factory near a city, that city will feed that factory. You know, it's the chicken and the egg comes first. They need each other, they feed off each other, and then of course the labor then necessitates transport, markets, shopping, and then inevitably telegraph, telephone, communication, and it all grows to feed the factories and can feed all of this. And this is the beginnings of the conversion of America from a majority rural population to an urbanized population, meaning that more of our population, of our yearly multiplying millions, is going to live in an urbanized environment rather than in a rural setting. Now, obviously, places like Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Boston, they're going to come to dominate the mindset of our urbanized environments. In your rural landscapes of places like the Midwest, they're going to start to become less and less densely populated as more and more of the mechanized production of agricultural labor or agricultural products means that less labor is necessary, and so more and more of those children that might have stayed on the farms 50 years ago start to head towards our factories. And that's the migration part of our urbanized and sort of population growth in our city structure. Now, the other part of the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization and all of this that's going to give us is a change in America from a debtor nation, an agricultural debtor nation, to really by 1915, 1917, the world's largest creditor and a fully powerful and fully industrialized nation that is standing on equal terms, if not above, all of the other countries of the world, in part because America avoids the most of the destruction of World War One. So post World War One, we go from agriculturally predominantly to industrial, and we go from rural to urban. Okay, and this creates the legends of Ben the Luggage Boy, of the Strive and Succeed stories, where he starts out as a luggage boy protecting a woman. And of course, at that point, she's got a father who's then going to reward him. It's part of that luck, part of that pluck or guile that leads in these myths and the mythology of Horatio Alger to somebody making it big. And of course, the real life examples of that are going to be Carnegie and Rockefeller. Now, whether they came from nothing is not the point, but they come from less humble means to become the richest people in the world. And so that is going to be part of this series, that America and the Americanized dream is going to sell at least to a segment of its population. And it's going to be the major consumption for America, that we sell this. You can be anyone you want to be if you work hard. And so we'll sell that. You know, our expansion happens and we talk to the urban population moving from 10 to as many as 54 million across this 50-year period. Cities with 100,000 people are up from 15 to 68 by 1920. 500,000 people. You had two of them in 1870. You now have 12 in 1920. New York Philadelphia, Chicago, they have over 1 million people, and those are your true urbanized centers. Okay? Now, we do have some natural increase, the birds and the bees and people going about their day-to-day lives, but a lot of this, the majority of this explosion of population was due to migration and immigration. Okay? Migration is talking about Americans moving from the countryside to urban environments to work in these factories. And of course, the immigration, a lot of these populations moving out of war-torn Europe that is desperately seeking a better life, a better opportunity. They're seeking their fair share of the Horatio Alger myth. And if you've been in an urban industrial situation and you don't like your life there, you want to get to a more agricultural, pastoral life like your forefathers had, like the generations before you had, well, America seems the prime opportunity. They have vast amounts of land. They get so much land, they're giving it away out on the frontier in the 1870s. Well, that myth, that idea, that sort of prospect is going to appeal to a lot of people in Europe, and that'll feed a lot of the immigration. But the immigration is coming from areas that in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s that we haven't traditionally seen in America, and that's going to cause significantly different problems. Okay? Now, the cities themselves, whether you're talking about New York, they're going to add new boroughs, they're going to add new areas, they're going to add new populations. And of course, the challenge for a city when it adds more and more population is to provide those basic services, whether it is police, whether it is fire, whether it is trash, water, sewage. This is going to be a significant problem, and that's what's going to feed the corruption of the Gilded Age. But we'll talk about that as we go forward. And here's our population density map. What you see here is, Massachusetts having 60% of it living in an urban population. New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, they are in New Jersey. They are that 40 to 60% in urban environments. And then, you reach down here and, very few cities, very few infrastructure. By the time we get to 1920, you still see the Deep South lagging further and further behind, but they had moved to 20%. But, say Arkansas, Mississippi, and the Carolinas, they were still relatively low. But the centers of population are driven by industry and driven by the railroads. St. Louis, Chicago, Michigan, and Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. All of these industrial sites are going to become urbanized and become centers for migration and immigration. Now, the migration we talk about, the population is going up in the east. Despite this huge push west, urban population is going up in the east. And the populations living out on the farms and living out in the rural areas is going down. And that's because mechanization makes that possible. I can produce more food with less labor because of mechanization. Now, that makes my sons and daughters expendable, that allows them to move to the city and get out of the countryside, which, head to the bright lights of the big cities. But think about the cost of mechanization. Think about the difficulties. It's great for the people who live in urban environments that food is cheaper, but what about the farmers? Food becomes cheaper because you can produce it faster and in greater quantities, but inevitably, you need to buy this tractor to keep up. You need to buy this product to be able to compete. Well, how do you buy that? Well, you buy it on credit. You get a loan from a bank. Those debts are going to have a significant impact on your farming communities. And it'll go to foster this age-old belief about agrarian disdain and dislike for bankers and for stock jobbers and for those who produce nothing but charge interest rates almost akin to usury, and the biblical sin that is associated with making money by loaning money. Okay? But the end result is a lot of your farm boys and girls are lured into the city. They fall into uh, industrial labor, and they get lost in the big city. Now, it's not just white population on the western frontier that's on the move. You've got your African American population that is moving as well. 32 cities in America by 1900 had significant concentrations of African American population. And we talk about Atlanta and we talk about Charlotte. These are not majority African American, but they have a predominance of the population in all of that. And when we talk about industrial labor, a lot of African American labor becomes an important source of that less skilled labor in southern cities or even in northern cities. And movement of African American population around the South is important. World War I will start to see African American population move outside of the South. That's going to be an important landmark, because moving from Mississippi, rural Mississippi, to Georgia, rural Alabama to Georgia to Atlanta, you're still living in Jim Crow. You're still living in the South. It's not going to be until World War I when you start to see significant populations moving outside of the South, and you realize not all of America is Jim Crow. Not all of America is like the Deep South. Now, there's still racism and there's still prejudice and segregation in some of these northern areas, but not to the legal extent that it exists in the South. And mirroring the African American population on the move is also Hispanic population in the Southwest, whether it's New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, or California. And of course, the Far East is also coming, whether it's China, whether it is Japanese population. Chinese and Japanese laborers are going to come in and be an integral part of the building of the transcontinental railroads and railroads beyond. So this melting pot is being stirred up, and that was the point of that initial image that we put up here, in that you've got Lady Liberty here stirring up what is a very racially stereotypical and of course racist caricatures of all of the different races that we're going to build into this melting pot. That's one thing that characterizes American views of the wider world, that there is a paternalistic, that there is an idealistic, but a very racist view, and it shows up in a lot of these caricatures, and it shows up in the idea that everyone around the world should want to be us or want to emulate us. And while this class will have the great heydays of the political cartoonists, we'll have to talk about the racial stereotypes that are still pervasive in these caricatures moving forward. Okay, so we've got our migration, okay, and all that's happening. Let's talk about immigration. And the immigration is coming with new immigrants. And by that we mean populations that haven't come before, and populations that are following what we consider chains of immigration. If you have a friend who leaves home and goes to live in the big city, and he tells you, and he writes you back a letter that says, hey man, it's great here, you should come live here too. Well, he's initiating a chain of immigration. You can live with me, you can stay with me for a little while until you get on your feet, until you find a job. That's what these chains of immigration are starting. Now, a lot of this immigration is coming from Italy, Greece, Poland, the Balkan territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian. Okay, and whether we talk about Italian unification in the 1850s and Greek separatism in the 1840s and 1850s, sees the Crimean War, and you also see the war between bear with me a second. I got to sneeze. Hold on. Okay, forgive me. When we talk about the strife and we talk about the wars, Austria is going to fight a war with Prussia. You're going to see France fight a war with Prussia, and you're going to see all of this conflict and all of the warfare. And it seems that Europe can't seem to get out of its own way in fighting all of these wars. And of course, the ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they don't like each other. They don't like the Poles. The Austro-Hungarians and the Russians don't like each other. The Italians and the Greeks don't like each other. How Sicilians and Italians don't like each other. So it seems like there's a whole lot of discord, and these groups seem to dislike each other intensely. And they're all coming here for a better life, which means they're poor when they arrive. And so they're escaping poor conditions across Europe in hopes of a better life here in Europe. And the majority of them will send their young men across in hopes of working for a few years and then maybe going home. About a third of them will actually make it back home. But what makes this new immigrants, and I put that in quotes, new immigrants, difficult for many traditional immigrant or Americans to deal with, is that the majority of them are either Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish, unskilled laborers, and speaking languages that we as Americans aren't necessarily that familiar with. And of course, they seem to have, because of Catholic or Orthodox beliefs, large families. And to a lot of Americans, it seems like we're being invaded by these strange new immigrants. Part of our English inheritance as Protestants is that we have a fear and an anxiety of Catholics. And if we don't think that that Catholic identity is still present, just look at one of the major points against John F. Kennedy was when he was running for president in 1960. It was his Catholic religion. And of course, the Orthodox, whether it's Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox churches, they're not your traditional Protestant denominations, and they have separate feast days and they have separate saints, and it all just seems different. And the scale of the immigration is what worries a lot of Americans, not just because of the economic hard times and the depressing of wages that some in the industrial sector would allege. It's that you're talking about millions across that 50-year stretch, 26 million immigrants coming in a 13-year stretch, 6.3 million immigrants, and 1882 saw 1 million come into the country in that 1 year alone. Now they're coming and they're settling and they are transforming these cities that they come to settle in. And the thought is that they would come and they would expand across this vast American landscape. But a majority of them are coming from to these eastern urban environments, and that's where they settle. They usually settle, a predominance of them settle within their ports of entry. Right? And so when you look at the map and it shows you where these new immigrants are coming, prior to 1900, okay, you've got a low percentage of Italian, Austrian, Hungarian, Poles, Russians, Eastern Europeans. You have relatively little in America. But of course, by 1920, you see a dip in Irish and you see a dip in English and a relatively steady a drop in German immigrants, spike in Poles, Russians, and of course your Eastern Europeans. These differences are what is going to worry so many Americans. And the fear about in 1890 that 9 million of this U.S. population was foreign born. But if you look at the urban environments, that seems a relatively low number. But if you look at these urban environments, 4/5 of Chicago, 2/3 of Boston, half of Philadelphia were foreign born. And if you look at New York City, they have twice as many Irish in their city than Dublin does. You've got a second Dublin there in New York City. So the Irish, of course, because of the effects of British overlordship, because of the effects of the famine, because of all of the issues that the Irish have faced in their own country, their escape to America in such vast numbers does worry a lot of people. Now, there was a movie, I don't know, I guess it must have been 15, maybe even 20 years ago now, called Gangs of New York. Daniel Day-Lewis is spectacular, but of course, Leo DiCaprio and Cameron Diaz and a few others are all abounding in all that. And it tells the story of 1860s and kind of the subcurrents of the immigration and the urban environments that you're going into. If you have a few moments, or if you haven't seen that movie, it's worth checking that one out on a little bit. But like I said, some of these immigrants are coming to work, come to save, to buy a plot of land back home, and probably about 30% do go back home to their country of origin. But the majority of them are going to stay, and this leads to what we call our nativist or xenophobic backlash. And there was a great political cartoon put out here by a commentary magazine called Puck. And it shows all of the nativists or the xenophobes here, that here they are now as wealthy Americans. But behind every one of them is a bedraggled, tired, huddled mass of an immigrant that came off the boat 50 to 100 years earlier. And it's trying to highlight the fact that America is a country of immigrants, aside from Native Americans. You've all come at one point. You've all come from lesser circumstances to remember from whence you've come, and they're going to look down on, shunt aside, and become very, very fearful of this long stretch of immigrants that are coming to America as we move forward. Now, the reaction is going to be one of, how do we get control of this process? And we're going to change our immigration policy because of it, and we're going to try to get control of it through really an entrepot, an entryway into America, and it opens as Ellis Island. And if you ever want a movie that would show you the entry point and sort of the path that a lot of these immigrants took, the second Godfather film shows little Vito Corleone coming over through Ellis Island, and he gets quarantined because he has tuberculosis and because he's sickly. And it also talks about, his name is Vito Antolini, and he's from Corleone, Sicily. And at Ellis Island, he's not speaking very much, and they simply give him, Vito, and Vito Antolini from Corleone. So they sign it in the books, he's just Vito Corleone. And so the treatment through which people would progress through Ellis Island. And this is trying to get control of a situation that was previously managed by the states, and it took about 30 seconds to register, and it was really just a turnstile. Ellis Island is a deliberate attempt to try to slow down the wave of immigrants that are coming into America. And if a ship comes across, you can look at first class ticket and a second class ticket and a third and a fourth and even a steerage. There were many different classes of passages that you could book onto one of these ships. Today we look at it at airlines. You've got your first class, you've got your business class, you've got your economy plus, and then you've got your basic economy. Well, your first and your business class passengers, they'd let them go through pretty quickly. Doesn't matter if they're sick. Doesn't matter if they're lame. Doesn't matter if there's a possibility that they might not be able to work. Because if you've got money for a first or second class passage on one of these steamships, you are very unlikely to become a ward of the state and to be destitute on the streets. You've just paid a lot of money to get here. You clearly have money, and therefore we're not worried about you. Now, the fourth class, the steerage class, these would get a more rigorous examination, such as it was. They'd walk them up to the third flight of the stairs in the building to see if anybody got short of breath. Doctors would examine them to see if they were ill. And of course, you're trying to weed out the lame, the sick, the people that would become wards of the state. And at that point, that's where Vito Corleone is going to wind up being in quarantine where he can see the Statue of Liberty because he has to quarantine because of tuberculosis. Okay? Now, the reality of all of this is that probably around 3% are going to be turned away. Very, very low numbers, very limited in terms of how many people are turned away from Ellis Island and rejected from coming into the country. But it's the beginning. It is the first attempt to slow down the tide of immigrants that are pouring into our nation. And when they reach these neighborhoods, you seek out the comfortable, you seek out the familiar. If you're from Texas and you move to a foreign country, odds are there's a Texan bar somewhere in that country, somewhere in that city. If you go to London, you can find a pocket of Texans in London. They have opened a bar somewhere that has Texas memorabilia all over the place. And you can find your barbecue, you can find your Tex-Mex, you can find all of these things. Because that's what immigrants do when they go to a new country. They center around the comfortable, they center around the familiar. And so they'll live in familiar neighborhoods because it's a difficult thing coming from an agrarian world in Italy or in the Eastern Bloc and coming to an industrial urbanized world. Employment is seasonal, very tenuous, and of course you don't speak the language and your surroundings are incredibly unfamiliar. And to that end, the chains of immigration are going to start to create associations that give assistance to these new immigrants for jobs, for homes, for services, for newspapers and news of the homeland in their native language. And of course, you can find your Eastern Orthodox Church, you can find your Greek Orthodox Church, you can find your Russian Orthodox Church, you can celebrate your feast days, you can find your communities, you can find everything that you want, even the age-old animosities and hatreds that had existed for centuries over in Europe. You bring those over here to America too. You know, like we say, the Irish don't like the Scots don't like the Irish, and none of them like the English. Well, the same thing. Italians and Sicilians don't get along. And whether it is the ethnic groups of Serbs or Croats or whomever in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they bring these animosities over with them. Now, the fact that you can go into these neighborhoods and see predominances of Greeks and Poles and Czechs and Slavs, the insularity that these neighborhoods held together led to these Americanized fears about would they ever share the American values? Would they ever accept America? Would they ever learn to speak English? Could they be Americanized? To a certain extent, yes. But a lot of these neighborhoods are going to look more foreign than anything that some of these nativists and these xenophobes are going to be terribly comfortable with. And that's going to be the fundamental problem, is that you walk into neighborhoods like Little Italy, Chinatown, the Russian community of Brighton Beach, if you go to New York, there would have been blocks and there would have been regions that were very territorial and very ethnically oriented in and around these larger American cities. And of course, where are they living? Where are they staying? Well, a lot of them are staying in slums, and a lot of them are staying in tenements. And the most common tenement is going to become something called a dumbbell tenement. And I can show you a picture of sort of the frontage of what one of these look like, this dumbbell tenement here on the right. You would see blocks and blocks of these 5-6 story buildings, and it comes from almost a contest of how do you design a floor plan to get maximum use out of a 200 by 100 foot lot. And you could build them 8 to 10 stories high. You could get 30 to 40 4-room apartments on that lot. Maximum use. And because you're building it with masonry, 8 to 10 stories is about as high as you can get. Okay. By 1890, this was so pervasive that nearly half the dwellings in New York City are dumbbell floor plan tenements. Okay, now I don't know if you can see, this is where your light shafts are. These are where your windows are. There's not a whole lot of space for lights and windows. And when you're looking at that, you see out on the parlors on both sides and the living room, there's very limited windows. Okay? And you don't necessarily have a whole lot of ventilation. And when you look at this, these would be some of your windows, assuming there's not another one. So you've got, these are windows, great. You look at another window, and this is the only way you can get ventilation to some of these ground floor interior rooms. And a lot of these rooms will wind up housing an entire family. A family would live here, here, and here. So instead of one family occupying this whole apartment, you would have family after family after family after family living in individual rooms. And you'll see a tenement next to, in that bottom left picture, tenement next to shacks and shanties that are just leaned up against some of these buildings. The conditions in some of these New York City tenements are so poor, and the lack of light so poor, that you really don't get a photograph in some of these areas until you develop the flash photography of the 1880s and the 1890s. So you really are dealing with fundamental issues and fundamental problems of hygiene, of cleanliness. And here, when we finally start to take some of these pictures, you've got coal burning or gas or charcoal burning stoves, and so you have soot everywhere, and you have candles or kerosene lamps, and there's a candle there that you can see in that picture with the police officer to his right hand. Candles leave residue. Kerosene lamps leave residue. And that's where the origin of spring cleaning comes from, that it finally gets to a point where it's warm enough where you can open up your windows and scrub the walls from the lamps and from the soot from the candles. But these types of buildings are going to proliferate across, and these become the playgrounds for your kids, and the rooftops and the alleyways. And the trash chutes become clogged and home for vermin and rats and every urban nightmare that you can think of moving forward. And so when we talk about the afflictions, and we talk about the unsanitary conditions and the crime and the lack of bathtubs and the lack of, well, just basic cleanliness, and of course your coal burning stoves represent a fire hazard but also a pollution risk. And when we look at the just mind-boggling amount of trash generated at this time, and this isn't even our throwaway culture we're talking about. This is a household here in New York City that's generating 160 pounds of garbage, and this is per year, that you're generating 1,200 pounds, half a ton of ash from your fires, and 100 pounds of shoes, furniture, assorted rubbish at a time when there is no day-to-day trash pickup. We don't have these conditions set up in our area. So our urban environments are filthy, they are polluted. And if you look at a city like Pittsburgh, you got glass factories, steel mills, and oil refineries with no environmental protection agency to protect them. And therefore, you reach that situation where Lake Erie and some of the sections of the Ohio River, well, they just become ecologically dead zones. And Lake Erie in particular was prone to catching fire because all the petroleum waste that had been dumped on top of it. Now, worse than all of that, how do you get around your urban environments? What's the main mode of transportation in the 1800s in your cities? If you guessed a horse, that's correct. But if you've ever watched a parade go by, what's usually followed right behind that parade? A bunch of people to scoop up the poop from the horses. Think about an urban environment where you have 3.5 million horses And every day they produce pounds of manure and a gallon of urine, if not more. What does that do to your urban environment? What does that do to your cities? And there's a very iconic image here of New York City and your cobbled streets that have potholes and you're running ditches. And what do you do with your kids here? Well, they're playing in the street, they're playing in the sewer, they're playing next to a dead horse, because whose job is it to pick up the dead horse? We don't have the urban environment and the urban municipal services yet that are there to do all of these things for us. And of course, if you look at your industrial factories and you look at the belching waste and you look at all the factory waste that's going to flow into our rivers, it is no wonder that all of these become ecological nightmares that we have to clean up. And our cities are going to go one of two ways. They're going to go up or they're going to go out. Vertically, we're going to have our first skyscraper here. Okay, now this is the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. This is the first of our all steel framed high rises, if you will. We can make the frame out of steel. You're no longer limited by the weight capacity of masonry. 8 to 10 stories was about as high as you could build with stone before the weight of the upper floors would crush the lower floor stone. Steel, we don't have that. The structure, the weight of the building is supported by the girders and the I-beams, and then everything else can run off of that. So the masonry, the decorative frontage is no longer load-bearing. Now, above 10 floors, that is only really desirable with the invention of the electric elevator and the reliability of those electric elevators and the gravity brakes in 1871. So that makes this possible. And what we're going to see after the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, this building still stands today. It's still present there. And we're going to see a mushrooming of taller and taller buildings in the 1900s. That becomes your urban sprawl upwards. But the majority of our growth of cities is going to go out. And we call this the great suburbanization of our cities. We leave the interior. We leave the urban environments. We leave the downtown arenas. And we get out of the smell and we get out of the crowds, and we're going to move to the suburbs. Well, how do a lot of these people travel back and forth from the suburbs into the cities? Well, they're going to do it through Edison's electrification and through the alternating current. We're going to have electric streetcars start to proliferate in all of our urban environments. You're actually going to start to see the development of smaller commuter rail lines as well. Some will elevate their tracks, and some will dig subways. If you look at Chicago and you look at Boston, they have elevated rails, some electrified, some steam driven. New York is going to go underground for subways. And these interurban cross cities, electrified and motorized railways are going to make these suburbs possible. And it is the wealthy that are going to gradually start to escape the city center areas, and they are going to run for the hills, right? They're going to escape the stink, they're going to escape the crowds, and what you will also see is a gradual abandonment of your city centers and left to the poor and left to the downtrodden as the rich start to pay the 5-cent fare back and forth. A lot of these electrified rails are going to be produced with a hydroelectric dam. Okay? And so here we have the story as it kind of goes up. A hydroelectric dam, Scientific America is going to highlight one of these. Previously, you had these horse-drawn or mule-drawn carriages that would take you to and from downtown. But you build a dam and you have a hydroelectric power plant right here off of that finished dam. Okay? Now from that point, what you can do is have these electrified trolley cars that would run up and down these lines, and you can have these suburbs some of them running out here to the middle of nowhere, really. This is where you start to build homes outside the downtown areas. You can also have electrified lights. And in your first suburb here of Hyde Park in Austin, Texas, you're going to see these towers start to proliferate. We have an electrified system powered by hydroelectric power on the Colorado River. The dam at the current site there at Lady Bird Lake, and it powers these magnesium arc lamps that are called moon towers. And you have two pieces of magnesium and you arc an electrical current across it, so it gives a moonlight glow on a night when the moon wasn't necessarily shining that bright. But these are trolley cars that head out down Speedway, down Guadalupe, these central roads heading out of downtown Austin towards Hyde Park, which is around 35th to 50th Street in Austin. That is your first suburb here in Austin, Texas. Goes to show you exactly, how far and wide these types of electrified projects will stretch. In the 1890s and the 1900s, this is being built. And I don't know if you noticed it, but Scientific America here is telling you, okay, in September, right, we are building this in the 1890s. We're building this and we're putting this all together. And it looks very nice. Here you would see the Hula Hut and you'd see Mozart's and you'd see all of this stuff right here. And the LCRA and sort of Terrytown is right over here in Austin. Well, the person who built the dam was a Northeasterner, and he built it on a constant flow model for a Northeastern river. And unfortunately, the Colorado has really two stages at this time. It has a trickle, which is through most of the summer, but periodically it can go into just absolute raging flood. And that's what happened here to the dam. It was finished and fixed in that beautiful pink granite that was quarried out near Enchanted Rock. And it's the same granite that's used to build the Capitol here in Austin. But the water kept flowing over and over the center channel of the dam, that the spillways couldn't handle the volume of water, and it undermined the footing at the center of the dam and just washed it away. If you drive past Redbud Trail off of Lake Austin Boulevard and you look back, you can still see some of the fragments of the old dam in the channel there downriver from the current dam. That's some of the problems and that's some of the pitfalls that come with the push, the drive to get urbanized, to get industrialized, even in areas which you wouldn't necessarily think about it. And of course, the end result is that Austin is going to be catastrophically hit by this. You lose hydroelectric power, you lose your water treatment plant, you lose a lot of the electrical benefits that this dam brought, and it's going to take a while to rebuild it, and it's going to take a while for Austin to recover. Now, one of the ways a lot of these cities tried to invest in itself was through the utilization of political machines. Okay? Now, we think of political machines as bad, and we think of them as corrupt and greedy. And this guy here, Boss Tweed, he is the poster boy for graft and corruption and malfeasance. But in a political machine's minds, they're addressing a political and a social vacuum. That all of these immigrants are coming into America and they need services. And they're willing to provide jobs and clothes and housing for your vote. And each ward and each precinct are tied together under one of these bosses. And of course, Boss Tweed there being the most nefarious. But they would go down to the docks and they would welcome the Irish. And again, I reference you that movie, Gangs of New York, where it shows Tweed going down and welcoming the Irish. Vote Tammany, he tells them. Vote for Tammany Hall. That was the famous political machine there in New York. And these political machines that control local organizations, they'll cater to the immigrants, and they'll know their struggles, they'll know what they need, and they'll offer them social support in exchange for the vote. This is the first time being a politician becomes a full-time job. And being a public person means that you have to be out and amongst them. You've got to kiss babies. You've got to shake hands. You've got to be seen, which means they spend a lot of time in saloons and in bars and in restaurants. And these guys were incredibly good at it. And if you can elect aldermen and you can elect city councils, you can control city government, and you can determine where these contracts are awarded, who picks up the trash, who digs the sewer lines, who provides plumbing. And this can be viewed as either a little honest graft and hard work and gratitude, or just a little bit of good old-fashioned American kickbacks and corruption. The one thing that you can say about these political machines is that they are rarely as corrupt and dictatorial as they were portrayed in the movies or in anything else. But they're certainly not neutral or fair. They do enable bridges and libraries and parks and sewers and trash to be picked up. And they deliver water lines and they deliver paved streets, but at exorbitant and inflated costs. And in a lot of ways, they leave some of these new immigrants out in the dark, whether it's blacks or Poles or Italians or immigrants out there. You know, the Irish concentration was so great that if they all unified behind one candidate, nobody else had a chance to win. And so for these political machines, this is why it's called the Gilded Age, because if you can control a local level, you can control city organization. If you can control a city, then you can control the state legislature. And then from there, you can go on to control all the other avenues of politics in the 1870s, the 1890s, to the 1900s. Okay. One of the more corrupt endeavors is the New York County Courthouse. That building still exists, and it was under the auspices of Boss Tweed that this was built. Now, this was legendary for being enormously behind. The budget tripled, and you had common painters and plasterers in today's money that were being paid thousands of dollars a day, which, of course, you inflate the budget, you inflate all of this, you pay kickbacks, and everybody's getting rich, and eventually the county courthouse will be built. But not before this malfeasance and corruption is exposed, and Boss Tweed here has to run away. He flees the country to avoid being arrested for malfeasance, but he is so caricatured and so cartooned and lampooned that when he arrives in Spain, he's easily recognized and put back on a boat to New York City, where he spends the rest of his life in jail for corruption and fraud and malfeasance. That's why this era becomes known as the Gilded Age. And to be gilded is to be covered glittering in gold, right? It looks great on the outside, but inside it is being eaten from the inside by, you see all of these different caterpillars gnawing on the tree of liberty, and you've got Grant, and you've got and over here would be Johnson hacking down the tree of liberty with grantism and fraud and corruption and indifference and more fraud and ineptitude and bribery, and we've got all of these things that need to be reformed. As we move into the 1890s, the 1900s, there will be that progressive reform movement that'll want to change all of this, that'll want to repeal, repair, and fix the dirty, stinking, polluted, overcrowded industrial world that we live in. But that's going to take some time, and that'll be the subject of our next lecture when we come back.